It's been an exciting start to this landmark gathering. I'm really honored to be part of it. And I look forward to many more years of this kind of celebration. This is what we should be celebrating in Africa. Great people, people who have humane hearts to contribute to society. And the celebration of CJ today for me gladdens my heart enormously. Let me start by asking, what did Callistus actually think about Africa's industrialization? At a lecture celebrating Kenya's 50th independence anniversary in December 13, 2012, he remarked inter alia, Kenya's post-independence constitution was designed to maintain socio-economic continuity. It reinforced Kenya's position as an agricultural economy, supplying raw materials to Western countries. Kenya got accustomed to this role and continued to be defined by its coffee, tea, flowers, and tourism. Then he adds, no country can build a durable future on the basis of exports of raw materials. Despite today's fascination with Africa's raw materials, the continent's future lies in shifting to innovation-led economies. He added, newly industrialized economies have over time decoupled their innovation strategies from their raw materials exports. Taiwan's largest export in the late 1950s were mushrooms and asparagus. The country did not become a world leader in semiconductors by adding value to mushrooms or to asparagus. Similarly, Thailand did not dominate the world market for disk drives by adding value to rice. Neither did Kenya develop the mobile money transfer industry by adding value to coffee or tea. And he added, what we need requires thinking beyond the confines of specific raw material exports. Industrialization, underline, cannot be pursued as a passive byproduct of raw materials exports. What is needed is an explicit strategy to transform the structure of the economy through technological catch-up and leapfrogging. This is what Kenya failed to do over the last few decades for several reasons. And I will add that I say this is what Africa failed to do over the last 50 years. And it is Einstein's textbook definition of insanity. And I quote Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Abika, you may project the slides now. In this paper, I'll try to address the topic of this keynote speech under the following subtitles. First, why the renewed debate on industrialization? Two, what underlies the poor industrialization record of African countries? Third, does an abundance of natural resources predetermine a negative development outcome? Four, how countries have in the past used natural resources as a basis to build strong economies. And I will then propose the next steps for Africa as the organizers have requested. Next slide, please. So please go on. Why the comeback to industrialization? Let me take this off. Okay. Number one is the COVID pandemic showed that countries with weak manufacturing capacity, they are extremely vulnerable to not just economic shocks, but real health and food security risks. Number two, the lessons of the last 50 years of Africa post-independence shows that countries that are poorly diversified, and I mean in terms of both market diversification of their products and their technologies, in their technological production base especially, and their export basket, experience disproportionately large volatility and huge swings in their fundamental economic variables. This is especially true for resource-dependent countries. They are the most heavily impacted of all these countries. The third reason why this has staged a comeback is that despite implementing the trade liberalization measures over the past decades, African countries did not realize the promised growth and development dividend. These countries continue to remain at the bottom rung of the poverty ladder. In large part, the reason is that we failed to develop our technological base and to diversify the economy of African countries. And the last point is that, this second to the last point is that the African Development Bank has made, as one of its pillars, industrialize Africa. And this is an agenda that has been pursued. So it never went under the radar in Africa. It never went under the radar for us. It's been a consistent debate here at the African Development Bank and in most of African countries, particularly also within the context of the AU. And the last point is that we have fallen so far behind, and it's so glaringly obvious now that something is wrong with the way we do things. Next slide, please. Next slide. I just tried to summarize, as we all know, that we were in the same boat with most of Asian countries in the 50s. They were challenged, just as we were challenged. Most countries in Asia, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, were in very serious troubles. In the 50s, average Asian had almost half as much income as African. By 2016, the reverse was the case. And we know the famous story of Korea, which was described in all manner of words, including USAID that called Korea a bottomless pit for aid. On the contrary, in the 50s, Africa possessed huge amounts of minerals, including strategic minerals, cobalt, bauxite, aluminum, graphite, manganese, and vanadium. What we see, for example, today in DRC, Congo, in Nigeria, in Angola, you find DRC, for example, supplies 70% of global cobalt, but this country remains poor, and the majority of its people have remained in very dire straits. Next slide. Again, I make the case that the reason why others have left us behind is that they have actually paid so much attention to industrialization. Many of the Asian countries we projected on the screen have no commodities, as we all know. What they did was maximize their competitive advantage to do both what we call horizontal diversification and vertical diversification. Malaysia, Vietnam, all of them started as agrarian societies. What they didn't do was stop there. What African countries have done is to stop there, as the quote from Callisto said. The success also lies in 3 decades of very focused leadership and sustained industrialization. Many of our countries, and we have looked very closely at many of them, either they are stuck in minerals and raw material export. Of course, combined with the legacy of colonialism and slave trade in the early 50s meant that there were very few labor to actually build industry, but we've gone beyond that now. What has happened is that institutions, very perverse institutions, governance system, human behavior that have led to greed and grievance have taken root in most of African countries. Next slide, please. When you look at, I'll show 2 examples of 2 commodities just to illustrate. For example, Africa accounts for 70% of world cocoa beans. 80% of this cocoa is already sold. In other words, it's not even available for processing. We have those who have already booked to take them out of Africa, even before they were produced. So what has happened, even though 21% of world cocoa grinding is in Africa, only 1%. We are only part of 1% of global chocolate market, which is the end result of cocoa beans. And what is the implication? Anytime you export your commodities, you're actually exporting jobs from Africa. This is why we have what we call structural unemployment in Africa. In 2018, for example, the chocolate industry employed about 70,000 people in the EU and the US. The global chocolate industry in 2019 was valued at $106 1.6 billion and is projected to 147 billion by 2025. The share of Africa that produces 70% of it is only 6 billion. So this is the anomaly why countries in Africa remain poor, simply because we are not industrializing, we are not innovating, and we are not adding value. The second example of what I call the reversal of fortune, if you look at these two pictures, which is produced within the African Development Bank, look at cotton on the left side, the nominal price of cotton 60 years ago at that point. And look on the right side, the red graph. If you compare the nominal and real price, what is happening is that it has been trending downwards ever since 1960 in terms of the real price, not the nominal price, which is affected by inflation. This means that countries exporting the same quantities of cotton annually since 1960, they will receive less export revenue today than they did in 1960. So why are we surprised that Africa remains poor? Why are we surprised that all of these countries remain exactly, in fact, many of them are worse off than they were in the 60s? Next slide. So how do we explain this reversal of, how do we look at this reversal of fortune? Look at the contrasting fortunes and performance of those who industrialize, those who innovate. I present here the per capita income, the relative movements of income of the continent. And this graph doesn't need any explanation. What is here is that even though you see at the point in 1961, we're precisely almost at the same point in terms of share of average income. Over the years, these countries have totally left Africa behind. The calculation is based on the constant USD 2010. Next slide, please. So reversal of fortune has manifested not just in this movement of income, but also in all manner of social, technological, and industrial metrics. Compared with the other countries in Asia, the differences are really stark. All of them have recorded, and I give a few examples. In the paper itself, I gave a very elaborate comparison between so many of these countries. By 2019, the income of Korea was 6 times that of Algeria, 9 times that of Angola. And remember, these are countries with huge oil resources. All these countries had the same income levels in 1980, 40 years ago. Nigeria had income 6 times that of China. It might shock many people. Sudan, 2.5 that of China's income. In 2019, of course, China's income had skyrocketed. It's become the second wealthiest country in the whole world. The widening disparities are truly shocking. And what has happened, what I call reversal of fortune, always are due to upheavals, politics, wars. But what we see even more consistently now is that this reversal of fortune is the characteristics of commodity producers, those who simply produce, export, and not processing them. Next slide, please. I give another measure of industrial dynamism, which is export share of manufacturing. Where you see here is on the left side, and pay attention to the Y scale. You see that the scales are different. It's not just about the movement forward, but also in scale. Asia on the left side, Africa on the right side. Asia has gone up right from the 60s, and in some, you see the steepness of the graph at some point shows extremely fast rate of growth. The gap has widened so enormously. And of course, at some point also Africa was growing, and you see that steep also. Then began the trouble, and then began also the volatility that you see in these zigzags of the graphs. Next slide. Again, you see the export growth in terms of money. Find the same picture. I don't need to spend too much time on this one. What is important is that unprocessed mineral and energy and raw materials account for 80% on average of all African exports. And agriculture employ between 65 to 8% of the workforce in the region. You know, we make a lot of noise about having 65% of all arable land in the world. What is the use of land when you don't use it? The Netherlands, for example, has a very little land. But on 2019, it exported $95 billion euros worth of agro-foods. So on the same piece of land, you can generate 10 times what Africans are not generating. So this is the point the professor from MIT was making earlier. Man, technology, and innovation on the land is what changes the game. Next slide, please. So how do we explain it? There had always been theses about resource costs. The point is that it's not the possession of a resource that makes it a cost. It is what we make of it. It is how we use it. And it's what kind of institutions develop around it. We, as Africans, have relied on the low growth pathway of commodity extraction and export. Whereas there are many Asian countries like Malaysia, like Vietnam, they also were dependent early on commodities, rubber in Malaysia, for example, rubber, oil palm, and so forth. But they changed the game through what I call horizontal diversification. They make very sophisticated products, complex products in that horizontal processing of those commodities. So is it a cost or is it a blessing? Next slide, please. See here on this graph, I looked at within Africa itself. You look at the oil exporting countries and the non-oil exporting. The difference is very clear. For the oil exporting countries, manufacturing had always not been a priority for them, and they don't get much out of it for many reasons that we can't begin to even talk about here. Because of the greed that comes from easy money, you create institutions that actually are disposed to opposing manufacturing. In the non-oil exporting countries in Africa, Ethiopia and all the other countries, we actually found very fast growth before COVID. So this is in-region comparison between the producers of oil and the non-producers and non-exporters of oil. Next slide. So what are the implications? I have about 5 of them. I'm not going to go into too much details. Number one is that when the country depends too much on natural resources, dependence, not possession, those countries tend to not do industrialization and they tend not to be innovating. But those countries that made good use of their natural wealth, converting such assets to good use by innovating, processing, usually they have around them a framework of sustainable macro policies, equitable governance system, and usually they're intolerant of corruption. Number two, these are, it's a big body of work that anybody can look at. The second reason, or the second implication, is that natural resource dependence undermines industrialization and innovation. What we know from history is that the earlier industrial nation, that the US, at some point, US was the biggest exporter of raw materials, minerals, even though they were in the country with had the most asset of those things, but because of the technological base of the country, they deployed all manner of resources, innovations to actually process minerals. They went into all manner of new discoveries of oil, of all manner, because they possessed the technological base to process those minerals. So it wasn't a cost with the earlier industrial nations. It became a cost 50 years down the road from now, because most of our nations inherited these resources without preparation. They don't have the human capacity, they don't have the technological capability, and they in turn develop the perverse institutions, which I call the elite greed and citizens' grievance. So you have a situation where you develop a situation where the elite, a few maybe 1-2% of the population appropriate all of the wealth of the land, and you have a country always in conflict. So the capacity to produce, trade, and specialize and export is a proxy for technological capability. And this is really what we are seeing now. Even now in the 21st century, diversification and structural transformation is still taking place. There had been earlier debate how, Africa will not be able to industrialize the way. We don't need to industrialize the way Asia industrialized. We don't need to do it the way Britain industrialized. You don't need to do it the way Japan industrialized. The key principle is that countries must industrialize in their own way, given their comparative advantage and given what nature has endowed them with. The fourth implication is that it also jeopardizes technological learning and economic growth. Industrial manufacturing largely drives economic development. The key requirement is continuous technological learning, which underpins economic diversification and structural transformation. When a country is locked into resource extraction and trade, it tends to record what I call the decline in the traded sector once they begin to enjoy resource boom. In other words, if you are not processing, you are not learning. If you are not processing, you are not innovating. Basically, often all your labor shifts to traded, non-traded sectors. You find young people move to the banks, they read computer science, they read engineering. They all find themselves in the banking sector or tourism. I saw the story of a guy who read mechanical engineering and he's now become I don't want to say a clown, is a, what do you call them? These people, comedian. He's doing comedy. He read mechanical engineering, and so many of them like that. Next slide, please. So here you see the advantage of export diversification. The story of China is very telling. In 1989-90, the manufactured export of China, see it at almost maybe 90 billion, 100 billion. Within 40 years, China's export is about $3 trillion. Same with South Korea. It might look small to you, but what Korea exports in a month is more than what Nigeria gets from oil the whole year. That's the truth. And you see Vietnam following on the same trail. In the case of Nigeria here, you find that what is happening is that what it was exporting in 1998, 1990 is still the same thing that it's doing in this 2019. Oil, gas, this and that. In other words, these countries of ours are not diversifying their economies. That is why they are subject to volatility. They are subject to all manner of dysfunctional institutions. So this is, and of course, in the case of Africa, in fact, there has been deindustrialization in South Africa. So what we are saying here is that what China is exporting in 1 year is close to what the whole of GDP of Africa. Next slide, please. So what are the suggestions for future industrial policy? I preface by saying that the choice of policies and the dedicated leadership that propel the use of industrial policy in the other places post-World War, especially in the Asian region, is what helped them to achieve sustained GDP growth. Number two lesson is that neoliberal policies, and I'm not saying not all policies fail, particularly based on privatization, liberalization, stabilization, without the technological base, had brought about a decline in industrial dynamics. And I'm not the only one saying it. It's even the Washington consensus people themselves accepted it, that they made huge mistakes. Number 3 point is that there is no one size fits all that will work in all situations and for all seasons. Policies can be misapplied and misused. Policies can be used in a way that is not competent. What distinguishes the less successful performers is less the policy use than the neglect of the objectives for which it is meant. So next slide, please. So what do we suggest? Three quick things. Number one is that Africa must pursue an active industrial strategy. And we are suggesting that we should take agribusiness as the base. This is where we find our comparative advantage now, while continuing, of course, to promote other industrial sectors. And the services sector also, which has helped a lot of African countries. While the region has challenges of poor infrastructure, what we suggest is the use of localization of industrial zones. And the African Development Bank right now, we are leading a particular model called the Special Agro-Industrial Processing Zones. How it's different from the usual special zone is that we deliberately are promoting this located within rural communities. So using zonal approach and locational approach to actually lift zones of poverty into prosperity. And in fact, actually building new secondary cities. Economic history has shown that without diversification into industrial manufacturing, including modernizing agribusiness, this is the key. I myself, in the early days when Callistus talks a lot about agriculture, I used to, because I came directly from purely industrial side. Later on, I began to really understand what colleagues were doing at IDS. People like Rafi Kaplinski and others were pushing all of those together, that you need to modernize your agriculture in order to go away from the agrarian society. Without doing this, the future had always been bleak for those countries that do not industrialize their economy, particularly agriculture. The second thing is to use clustering and agglomeration. And again, it ties to the first one. What we have found in our studies right now, over there, when I was at UNU, we wrote several books on clustering with colleagues. From a development perspective, as well as investment policy perspective, special economic zones should be seen as models of industrial strategies and as an integral instrument of industrial policy that stimulates clustering. And to see the success of Asia, they have 75% of the over 4,000 special economic zones as of 2018. China alone has over 2,500. Korea has 900 industrial parks. 50% of them are agro-industrial parks. These are instruments that others are using in plain view that we have not been using. Vietnam, which until 1975 was at war, had 376 industrial parks in 2018. So we are pushing this idea that because of the deficit of infrastructure in especially big countries, we need localization of and clustering of industries in order for us to begin to develop our economies. Next slide, please. The third point, and to answer directly one of the questions I was asked about the role of innovation in industrialization. And if you recall, industrialization is the process through which nations transform from agrarian to modern societies by growing specialization, increasing complexity and differentiation. This was a process enabled by technical alterations, which by other means is called innovation. Without continuous innovation, you cannot deepen industrialization. The textile industry, for example, is one of those examples, and I don't want to go too much into it. But yes, the point is, in the context of latecomer countries like Africa, we should aim to foster manufacturing, deepen our innovation capacity, and to pay attention to those critical challenges. We must formulate new industrial innovation policy that pay attention to critical challenges, especially SDGs number 1 to 3, poverty, hunger, disease. All of us know how humiliating African countries are now. That when some countries in Europe and America have 4 times the vaccines they have, African countries don't even have 2% of their population vaccinated. This is really a problem that we have neglected for 50 years, taking the the easy path of just exporting raw materials. And by this, we have neglected to develop our industrial base. This is where Africa has ended. And I think this is the turning point as far as I feel that there is actually a turning point. This is a time that we need to now take a decision every country gets to a point where it has to take a decision. In the 1970s, India had such a turning point. India was facing a situation where its citizens are not going to get medicine. And they went about to do what they call the product patents bill, basically saying, well, yeah, you can patent a process, but you can't patent the product. We are not going to buy malaria tablets, $2 that is being sold in rich societies. In India, we don't have the money. That turning point is what changed the pharmaceutical sector in India today. Today, Indian pharma supplies almost 60% of global vaccine. They did the same thing in 1964, and that became a turn in agriculture. They refused aid, and then they decided, look, we need to change the narrative for wheat. This was the beginning of Asia's green revolution, and it led to their own industrial revolution. Africa has never had a green revolution, and we have never had an industrial revolution. I believe this is the time for all the major pillars of African organization, the AU, the African Development Bank, to take a decision and change the narrative of Africa. Next slide, please. Before I close, I just want to make the point. One of the icons of innovation policy was Freddie Lixt. He made a point very clearly that when we are framing industrial policy, he said real-world economics need to organize industrial policy framing within national context. Attaining global leadership, for example, in the sectors that Asians have done, were framed within national context. When you look at all of these countries, none of them apply the same thing. They are broad principles. So what is my point? Our transition, our change to not do what Liz called, he said, transitions do not occur automatically through, I quote, natural course of things. In other words, through markets alone. He said it will not occur. If we don't take seriously industrial policy, which means, yeah, government will have a role. We know many governments in Africa are very weak, but there are roles that governments must have and must be persuaded to have. And the last point is, List also made this point. He said countries that have progressed far ahead will prioritize their own welfare, and the theories they will make as universal will not favor the weaker countries. And I quote a particular Professor Vinian. He was saying, he said, Adam Smith and other classical economists took a cosmopolitan approach because they thought what was in the interest of England was also in the interest of the whole world at that time. In other words, what was relevant in the 17th and 18th century and in other countries may not necessarily be relevant for other times and for all countries, particularly for the economically less advanced in Africa at any time. This applies to us now. Africa needs to industrialize and innovate its way out of poverty, hunger, and disease. While we learn broad principles from others, learning from all those who have succeeded, we must find the right practices for the 21st centuries and for each national condition working within the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I thank you for the opportunity to deliver this keynote. Thank you so much.
Wow, if there was a way of doing like this, really, that was a powerful keynote speech, and thank you very much. I really liked your closing statement that Africa needs to industrialize and innovate its way out of poverty. How true that is. Thank you very much, Professor. I've seen quite a number of messages in the chat, and I've also seen a few questions. Maybe we'll start with the questions, and may I ask then very quickly, Dr. Anki Giri, to go through the questions, but can also read a few of the remarks and questions that came out of the chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Kigiri, please.
Thank you, Professor Uganda. Thank you, Professor Banji. I think that was excellent. We are actually getting very good comments on the chat. And some of those who are able to clap actually have clapped. So this is excellent. It was excellent. And many of the comments we are having are actually appreciations. But we do have a number of questions and comments, which I think it would be nice because we have a few minutes to respond to. And I will start with the questions. We do have somebody who did not, somebody by the name June. He is appreciating Professor Banji's presentation, and he's in agreement with the issue of moving our economy from consumption to production. She's asking, is there an active effort for the strategy shared to link with the AFTA in order to harness the free trade area, that is the free trade policy for Africa, and open up the trade of the goods produced within the region from the special economic industrial zones? That is the first question. I hope our keynote speaker is noting.
Yeah.
And then the other question is there an opportunity for negotiating commodities exchange or specialized production for countries to specialize in production and maximize on trade? It's very heavy questions, but very good questions. So maybe we can go with the two questions first, and then I will come back to the others on the chat. Back to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have and I'll be happy to engage colleagues on the details. The Special Agro-Industrial Processing Zone, for example, has a regional component because this is actually where the big impact is going to be to establish regional corridors. Let me say for the agro zone, we are already in 10 countries, including in Kenya. Actually, we were close to finalize negotiation of about 6 zones before the COVID issue struck. I just came back from Ethiopia about 3 weeks ago. Ethiopia, by the way, is probably one of the stars in agri parks today. They have 24 they have industrial parks. The bank is supporting about 4 agro parks there in Ethiopia. And what has happened is that actually half of those zones are now private. So what's the lesson here? Once we are able to show the exemplars, we begin to see private people actually coming to establish their own zones. So yes, to answer the colleague, we are connecting with AFTA. We are working with the Secretariat. And in terms of all the negotiation, in terms of tariffs, this is going to be critical because a zone by its definition has custom area delineation and all that. So yes, for those who are interested, right now we are going to board for 8 zones in Nigeria in October. We've done Senegal, we've done Mali. We also in Togo. We came back from Togo June 6th. They launched a big private zone done by Arise. Arise is a company formed with the Africa Finance Corporation and Ola, which is a big Singaporean company. I was shocked at what they've done in 1 year. You know, a lot of work. You can Google it. It's called PIA, P-I-A. Is the name of the company running that particular. So there is some measure of success. In the next 1-2 years, we really want to push very hard. We are negotiating about 9 in South Africa. We have ongoing discussions. So it's going to be tied very closely to the continental free trade area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those are excellent responses. We do have 2 questions from Francis, which I think you can pick them together. One is on which regional value chains would you recommend for a rapid industrialization in Africa? That's one of the questions. Okay. The other one, which educational reforms would you recommend that would support innovation and industrialization in Africa? Those 2 questions are from the same person, Mageni. But there's also maybe you may want to comment on something which a number of people have noticed has to do with governance and poor leadership in Africa, and which perhaps for one of the comments is linked to frustrations by the poor innovators, particularly the poor farmers, the small scale actors. Maybe you may want to comment on that one. Back to you, Professor.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Just before you address the three,
yes,
may we ask Professor Wesley, because his hand is up, so that he can also briefly ask his question, and then you can address the four. After that, we'll close, and we'll suggest that some of the questions that have been raised can be raised again during the longer discussion that we'll have under the moderation of Professor John Mugabe in the next session, because we have about 40 minutes discussion. So there we could also capture some of these questions you are raising. So Professor Wesley Harris.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Oganda. Professor Banji, thank you for an excellent presentation. I mean, superb. I'm hoping you will be kind enough to share those charts with us. Yeah. We have an opportunity in fisheries and Port Victoria. If I reflect on some of the finer hotels in Dubai, they have a rich selection of lobster and some fish, including fish that are caught off the coast of Chile. Can we look, and that fish is processed in Chile and sent to Dubai. Can we look at an opportunity in the Port Victoria area to do the same for tilapia? Tilapia as an exquisite element on the menus at the most 4-star, 5-star hotels. The same thing that's done in Australia regarding lamb. Can we do this? And to do it, I think we need electrification, we need processing plants, we need electric power, and we need people. Can we develop an industrial park or technology park, a technology zone to make this happen?
No, thanks, Professor Wesley. Okay. Thank you so much. Let me start with your... Yes. Yeah, Professor Gada?
Yeah, I'm requesting that you go ahead now.
Okay, so let me start with your question. So the answer is yes. Actually, the Arise program, this company called Arise, they have also now established a big special agro zone in Mauritania devoted just to fish. They have enormous fish assets which had not been tapped in the same way that we have bauxite in Guinea, we have uranium in Niger Republic, just like, So yes, this is what the bank is bringing to play in this. So we cannot, let's work with you and us and bring up a business case, a proposal for the Village Victoria area. I think this will be an excellent legacy for my brother CJ. So like I said, we actually have been working with the Kenyan government before COVID, and this could be a very important, and then we'll, Anna we can link up our office. The regional office actually is in Nairobi, so it's very easy to, I'll bring together all the colleagues who will push this forward. So Prof, that's your, the short answer to your question. And I cannot ask the charts, of course, Anne has them where they can share with you. And I will also send to you the framework for the special agro-industrial processing zone. So you see precisely how we do it, what we are doing across Africa. Just yesterday, The program we are doing, are we getting all these results across countries? Yes, just yesterday, Islamic Development Bank came that they want to put over $150 million in addition to whatever we have just for 2021 in Nigeria. So this is actually gathering momentum. And the same with Senegal, the same with Mali and other countries. Now, let me answer quickly the other question. Governance and poor leadership is an issue. In fact, one of the programs that Dr. Additional, the president of the bank, is proposing for the ADI. We have an ADI in the bank, Africa Development Institute. And I think we can work with you also across that. The ADI it's been there for many years, but it's been actually totally revamped. It's actually to deal with this governance issue. I mean, look across. What natural resource has done is to actually create all these perverse institutions of greed and grievances and violence, basically, all across our countries. So I think we have to find a way to deal with it. Because we are not industrializing, small and medium enterprises are also involved. They're also at a big disadvantage. It's not just the big companies. The big companies can buy their way. They can, they have influence, but the small players are always in big trouble. So yes, it's an issue and we need to deal with it. I don't ever give up on our region. We can never give up. And I don't think all countries, even those who are advanced now, went through all manner of issues and they were able to solve it. The last point is about the educational reform. I think we should pay a lot of attention also to values. We should pay attention to vocational and technical education. There's been too much emphasis on university, which is good. It's fine. We all went to universities. But at those levels, for those who have the skills and the ability to do it, we just don't have those skills. And this is why you go to any of these oil-producing countries, after 50, 60 years, they still have to rely on some multinational to do the most basic thing. We can't do anything. Oil, copper, Zambia, everywhere. We are looking at those cases, in detail now. So I agree with you. There has to be some form of education. I don't propose to say I know all the answer to that, but we all know that there has to be a change, and it starts from our mind. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Prof. Like you have seen, there are over 8 questions, actually 9 now. And I'm glad I've seen the chat that Professor Mugabe, the moderator of the next session, has kindly agreed that some of these issues will be followed during the next session. We now want to take a health break, and I would like then to invite once more Dr. Kigire